too. We've been following the McKinsey behavioral shifts throughout the pandemic, and we wanted to point out some of the overall changes that occurred. So on the left here, you'll see McKinsey created a new graphic to explain the 5 longer-term consumer behavioral trends. We're going to dive into each of these, but just to briefly explain each one. The first is spending is strong but bifurcated, and it varies across different consumer segments. Omnichannel is ascendant. Previously, this trend, as Bernie mentioned, was focused solely on e-commerce, but essentially consumers are now navigating seamlessly between in-store and e-commerce. Recovery differs across categories. As we make our way through the pandemic, some categories may have already been steadily moving toward recovery. Some were never really impacted much at all, and others, like travel or large capacity events, are still struggling to rebound. And then the last 2 shifts, numbers 4 and 5, they've remained largely unchanged from the previous McKinsey reports and the previous slide that Bernie was discussing. But both of these actions have become more ingrained. So we have homebody economy continues, with consumers still investing in their homes since we continue to spend so much of our time here. And loyalty shakeup continues. So we'll dive into this deeper, but 75% of consumers were continuing to switch brands, and this continues due to inflation and lack of products due to supply chain issues. So we'll jump into the first one, and again, this is the bifurcated consumer spending. So while strong overall consumer spending is bifurcated, which essentially is a fancy way of saying it's divided or split, and it's bifurcated along generational, income, and even vaccination lines. So more specifically, you can see listed here, millennials continue to spend at higher rates. And in a reversal of behaviors that we saw early in the pandemic, wealthy households have increased spend, while spending by lower income households has declined in recent months. And it makes sense when you think about how things have progressed. So early on in the pandemic, many people received stimulus checks, so this kind of helped boost spending with some of the lower income households, while the higher income households weren't able to spend the money that they typically would on larger ticket items like vacations. So moving on to the next trend, this is the idea that omnichannel is ascendant. So early in the pandemic, we saw a rise in e-commerce, and now there's been a blend of online and offline, with 60 to 70% of consumers researching and shopping both in-store and online. There's more opportunities to purchase online and pick up in store, and another part of this is the huge role that social plays in our purchases, influencing 40% of consumers. So while the line is blurring between online and offline, online sales were still 30% higher than pre-COVID levels. And all of these changes are raising consumer expectations. So we want to be able to easily shop across devices. If I start on my phone and end on my laptop, or I start in browser and I move to an app, I want my list of favorites to be readily available, and for any items I've added to my cart to follow me wherever I decide to move my attention or my shopping. And in store, we want more of an experience. So we want things to kind of resemble what we're doing online. We want suggestions to be offered, and we want it to feel more personal. So moving on to the third trend, this is the uneven degree of recovery that can be seen at the category level. As most of us are aware, certain categories or industries were obviously hit much harder by the pandemic than others. And so recovery among different categories continues to vary as well. This chart is highlighting the varied recovery across categories, and using myself as an example, when we look at this chart, I'm not going to skimp on my pets no matter what. So during the pandemic, nothing changed. If anything, I was spending more because I was home and I just wanted to kind of pamper them as much as I could. But they're my babies, so I'm not gonna cut any corners there. So it makes sense that this would fall under sustained elevation. But I wasn't splurging on myself in terms of outdoor out of my home activities, like going to concerts or going away on vacation. So you can see that these are areas that are lagging. And then as of recently, I was splurging a bit on clothes. The idea of returning to some sort of normalcy was on the horizon, and I came to the realization that my athleisure look probably wasn't going to cut it in the work environment or in most social settings outside of my house. So it makes sense that retail apparel is approaching recovery, as other people were probably having the same realization. And then moving to our fourth consumer trend, this is the entrenchment or solidification of the homebody economy. And as you can see here, 70% of people have changed, some permanently, the way they engage in activities. And this is both inside and outside of their homes. And the activities span a wide array of areas, from larger crowd events like theater, movies, concerts, and sporting events, to everyday activities like getting your hair cut, getting mani-pedis, or transportation, especially public transportation. Expectations about work environments have also shifted, with more than half of people craving or even expecting a hybrid experience moving forward. But even as certain new behaviors strengthen, there is a degree of emotional uneasiness that permeates many consumers' minds. In fact, only 25% of people said things are back to the way they were, and this was actually down from 38% in July, so you can see how quickly things continue to change. And then finally, our fifth and final consumer behavior trend is loyalty shakeup continues. Over 75% of consumers continue to make some change to their shopping behavior, whether it's switching brands, changing retailers or websites, or even trying a different shopping method. Changes in shopping behavior are more prevalent with a younger demo and higher income consumers. This is both good and bad when you think about it and the overall implications. On the negative side, brands have to worry about losing consumers, especially with price increases that have resulted from supply chain issues. But then on the positive side, now's the perfect opportunity to entice new consumers to try your products or services. And I feel like in the pandemic world, we're always trying to find the silver lining. So I will take whatever positivity I can from any situation. So moving on to the next slide, this is just kind of digging into the loyalty shakeup a little bit more, but this is looking at the generational differences. You can see the dark color represents Gen Z and the light blue represents millennials. And then finally, the dotted line represents all consumers. So the first thing you'll notice is Gen Z and millennials are above the line for nearly all of the shopping shifts, but there's some areas that set the two apart. For instance, millennials are more likely to buy private label or store brand, and they're also more likely to use a digital shopping method, which includes curbside pickup and delivery apps. So these were all behavioral shifts, but there are attitudinal shifts that have occurred as well and are going to have a long-lasting impact. So we wanted to make sure we talked about some of these things as well. Over 70% of consumers say that the pandemic has drastically changed their perspective on life. 76% learned more about their life priorities. And then the third bullet point kind of sums up all of the changes. Family and health, mental as well as physical, matter more than ever and are impacting consumer choices and behavior. While it sounds straightforward that family and health would be top priorities, this has become more evident throughout the pandemic. There's more focus on putting family first above careers or community involvement. Health is always a hot topic, especially in the new year as people start working on their resolutions. But we've seen this emphasis on health continue year-round throughout the pandemic. And while there's still a heavy focus on being physically healthy, there's been more of a push and more of a realization of how imperative it is to focus on your mental well-being as well. And then one point that fell off of McKinsey's trends, but is still extremely important to mention, is the value-conscious consumer. This idea of value can have varying meanings, which Bernie will dive into a bit later, but we wanted to make sure to call it out since it's a long-lasting shift that will impact consumer attitudes. And another piece of this is a brand's purpose. While there can be pitfalls or landmines involved with any brand associating itself with a cause, a brand's purpose continues to grow in importance for many consumers, and the right kind of connections can prove beneficial from a sales and marketing perspective. Not to make it about me again, but for me, I'm always willing to spend money if I know a percentage of the proceeds go to an animal shelter or some sort of animal preservation. Over the summer, I actually started using Amazon Smile because I figured if I'm going to purchase from a company that doesn't have the greatest track record, I'm at least going to make sure a percentage of everything I buy goes to a charity I care about.